The Wyoming wind carried nothing but dust and loneliness across the vast expanse of prairie grass that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In the late summer of 1883, the land lay parched and golden under a merciless sun, broken only by the jagged silhouette of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Here, where the earth met the sky in an unforgiving line, sat the small town of Bitter Creek, a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to huddle together against the wilderness like sheep against wolves. 20 miles northwest of town, where even the most determined visitors rarely ventured, stood a ranch that had seen better days. The fence posts leaned at tired angles, and the barn door hung slightly askew, creaking its protest with each gust of wind. This was the Kane Ranch, and it belonged to a man who had chosen isolation as deliberately as others chose companionship. Jedediah Kane stood on the porch of his cabin, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 35, he had the look of a man who had aged beyond his years. Deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much, shoulders that carried invisible weight. His dark hair, streaked prematurely with gray, hung past his collar, unkempt and forgotten. He watched the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him of things he'd rather forget. It had been 4 years since the fire, 4 years since he'd stood helplessly outside another building, watching flames devour everything that mattered. Sarah's screams still echoed in his nightmares, along with little Emma's cries that had been silenced too soon. The townspeople had tried to comfort him, told him it wasn't his fault. The oil lamp that had tipped, the dry timber that had caught too quickly, the speed with which the flames had spread. But Jedediah knew better. He should have been home, should have been there to save them instead of drinking in town, celebrating a successful cattle drive. Since that night, he'd become a ghost haunting his own life. The ranch continued to function. Cattle grazed, horses were broken, fences mended, but it was all mechanical, movements without meaning. He employed no hands, preferring the exhaustion of solitary work to the burden of human interaction. When he absolutely had to go to town for supplies, he spoke only when necessary. His responses clipped and cold. The good people of Bitter Creek had their opinions. Of course, in the general store, at the church socials he never attended, over fences and washing lines, they whispered. "That Jedediah Kane," they'd say, shaking their heads, "used to be such a fine man, had a laugh that could fill a room and a smile for everyone. But now, he's not a man who knows how to love anymore. Might as well be dead himself, the way he carries on." The sound of approaching hoofbeats pulled Jedediah from his brooding. He squinted into the fading light, making out the familiar figure of Howard Briggs, the town's postmaster and one of the few people who still attempted conversation with him. Howard's horse picked its way carefully along the rutted track that served as a road, its rider sitting uncomfortably in the saddle. "Evening, Jedediah," Howard called out as he reined in near the porch. He remained mounted, having learned that dismounting implied a social visit that would not be welcomed. Jedediah nodded, saying nothing. Howard reached into his saddlebag and withdrew an envelope. "Letter came for you, looked important, so I thought I'd write it out myself instead of waiting for you to come to town." He extended the envelope, which Jedediah took without comment. The paper was worn, having traveled far, and the handwriting on the front was shaky but familiar. Jedediah's jaw tightened as he recognized it. Captain James Morrison. Jimmy. As Jedediah had known him during their brief time together in the cavalry before Jedediah had bought himself out to marry Sarah, Jimmy had been the one person who'd written consistently after the fire, though Jedediah had never responded. "Bad news?" Howard ventured, noticing Jedediah's expression. "Don't know yet," Jedediah replied, his voice rough from disuse. Howard waited a moment longer, then touched the brim of his hat. "Well, I'll leave you to it. You need anything, you know where to find me." Jedediah watched him go, then looked down at the letter in his hands. Part of him wanted to throw it in the stove unread, to maintain the walls he'd built around himself, but Jimmy had been a good friend once, back when Jedediah had still believed in such things. With a sigh that seemed to come from his boots, he broke the seal. The letter was brief, the handwriting increasingly unsteady as it progressed. My dear friend Jediah, by the time this reaches you, I will have gone to meet our Maker. The surgeon says it's a matter of days now. A Confederate bullet I took at Chancellorsville finally finishing what it started. I have one last request of you, and I pray you'll honor it for the friendship we once shared. My wife, Evelyn, will be alone in this world when I'm gone. She has no family save a sister in Kansas who has troubles of her own. I've told her about you, about your ranch, about the man you were, and I believe still are, beneath the grief. She needs somewhere to go. Jediah, just for a while, until she can find her feet. I know I ask much of a man who seeks solitude, but I have no one else to turn to. She's a good woman, strong and capable. She won't be a burden. Please, old friend, give her a chance. Your brother in arms, James Morrison. Jediah read the letter twice, then crumpled it in his fist. The last thing he wanted was a woman on his ranch, stirring up memories better left buried. He'd built his isolation carefully, stone by stone, and now Jimmy wanted him to tear it all down for a stranger. He went inside, tossing the letter onto the table, and tried to put it from his mind. But as he lay in his narrow bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he could hear Jimmy's voice from years past. You watch my back, Jed, and I'll watch yours. That's what brothers do. 3 weeks later, on a day when autumn had begun to creep into the air with cool mornings and earlier sunsets, Jediah was repairing a section of fence when he spotted a figure walking up the road. Not riding, walking, carrying a single worn carpet bag and moving with the determined stride of someone who had already come too far to turn back. As the figure drew closer, he could make out details. A woman, as he'd expected. Her dress had once been black but had faded to a dusty gray, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. Her bonnet hung down her back, revealing hair the color of wheat that had been hastily pinned up. But it was her hands that caught his attention, red and rough, hands that knew work, and her eyes, when she finally stood before him, were the pale blue of winter sky, holding a defiance that seemed at odds with her obvious exhaustion. Mr. Kane? Her voice was steady despite the dust coating her throat. I'm Evelyn Morrison. I believe my late husband wrote to you about me. Jediah straightened slowly, his fence work forgotten. Up close, he could see the toll her journey had taken. The hem of her dress was torn, her boots worn through in places, and there were shadows under those defiant eyes that spoke of nights without sleep and days without adequate food. How long have you been walking? He asked, the question surprising him as much as it seemed to surprise her. Since this morning. The stage only goes as far as Bitter Creek. She shifted the carpetbag to her other hand, and he noticed the tremor in her arms from carrying it so far. That's 20 miles. Yes, sir, it is. She met his gaze squarely. I've walked farther. They stood there for a moment, taking each other's measure. Jediah wanted to tell her there was no room, that she'd wasted her journey. The words formed in his mind. But what came out instead was, well, you'd better come inside, get some water. She followed him to the cabin, her steps steady despite her obvious fatigue. Inside, she looked around the sparse room, a single chair by the fireplace, a narrow bed in the corner, a table with one plate, one cup. The home of a man who expected no company and wanted none. I won't be any trouble, she said quietly. I can sleep in the barn. I know how to work. Cooking, cleaning, tending animals. I can earn my keep. Didn't say you could stay, Jediah replied, though he filled a cup with water from the pitcher and handed it to her. She drank deeply, then set the cup down carefully. My husband said you were a good man, said you'd help me. Your husband didn't know me anymore. Perhaps not, but he believed in the man you used to be. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small daguerreotype, holding it out to him. This was taken just before he left for the war, against his better judgment. Jediah took the picture. Jimmy smiled up at him from the metal plate, young and confident in his new uniform. Beside him stood a younger version of the woman before him, her hand resting on Jimmy's arm. both of them looking at the camera with the hope of people who hadn't yet learned what the world could take away. "I'm not looking for charity, Mr. Kane," Evelyn continued. "Just a place to rest until I can figure out what comes next. I've got some money saved, not much, but enough to pay for supplies. And like I said, I work." Jedediah handed the picture back. Through the window, he could see storm clouds building over the mountains. It would rain tonight, maybe snow if the temperature dropped enough. 20 miles back to town through weather like that. "There's a lean-to off the barn," he heard himself saying. "Hasn't been used in years, but the roof's still good. You can stay there tonight. Come morning, we'll see." Relief flickered across her features, quickly hidden. "Thank you." He showed her to the lean-to, a small room that had once housed seasonal workers back when the ranch employed them. It was dusty and filled with forgotten equipment, but it had a cot and a small stove. "I'll bring some blankets," he said, then added grudgingly, "and some food. I can cook," she offered, "if you show me where things are." "No need. I manage fine on my own." That night, Jedediah ate his usual meal of beans and biscuits alone in his cabin, hyper-aware of the soft movements from the barn. She was out there cleaning, he realized, hearing the scrape of metal being moved and the swish of what sounded like an improvised broom. When he finally went to bed, he stood for a long moment at his window, looking out at the barn. A faint light showed through the cracks in the lean-to walls. She'd managed to get the little stove working. Something twisted in his chest, a feeling so foreign he couldn't name it at first. Then he realized, for the first time in 4 years, there was another human presence on his land, another heartbeat in the darkness. He turned away from the window and forced himself to lie down. Come morning, he'd send her on her way. He'd give her money for the stage, maybe even drive her to town himself. His life was exactly as he'd made it, empty, hard, and safe from the kind of pain that came from caring. He wouldn't let one travel-worn widow change that. But outside, the first drops of rain began to fall. And in the lean-to, Evelyn Morrison sat on the edge of the cot and finally allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, but from relief. She'd made it this far. Tomorrow, she'd prove she could earn her keep. The man in the cabin might be as cold and distant as the mountains that surrounded them, but she'd seen something in his eyes when he'd looked at Jimmy's picture, something that hadn't quite died yet, no matter how deep he'd tried to bury it. As the rain intensified, drumming on the roof of the lean-to, she unpinned her hair and shook it loose, running her fingers through the tangled strands. Tomorrow, she thought, tomorrow she'd start showing Jedediah Kane that some things, once broken, could still be mended, if you had the right hands for the job. The morning came early and cold, with frost glittering on the grass like scattered diamonds. Jedediah woke as he always did, in the dark before dawn, and for a moment forgot that anything had changed. Then he heard it, the sound of someone moving around outside, the creak of the barn door, the soft lowing of cattle being tended. He dressed quickly and stepped out onto the porch, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. Evelyn was already at work in the barn. He could see her silhouette moving among the cattle. The animals, normally skittish around strangers, seemed calm in her presence. "Morning, Mr. Kane," she called out, not turning from where she was checking on a pregnant heifer. "This one's close. Maybe tomorrow. Day after at most." Jedediah frowned. He'd been watching that heifer himself. Knew she was near her time. "I didn't ask you to check the cattle." "Didn't need to. Animals need tending whether you ask or not." She straightened, brushing her hands on an apron she'd produced from somewhere. "Coffee's on the stove, biscuits in the oven." He stood there, caught between annoyance and surprise. The smell of coffee drifted from the cabin, real coffee, not the bitter brew he usually made, against his better judgment. He went inside. The change was subtle but undeniable. The table had been wiped clean, the floor swept. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the room. On the stove, a pot of coffee steamed alongside a pan of biscuits that were just beginning to brown. His few dishes, usually left dirty until he ran out. sat clean and drying on a cloth. She came in a few minutes later, carrying a basket of eggs. Your hens were hiding their eggs all over. Found these in the strangest places. You'll have a proper breakfast for once. I didn't ask me to cook, I know. She cracked eggs into a pan with practiced efficiency. But I told you I'd earn my keep. Can't do that sitting idle. They ate in awkward silence. Jedediah unused to company, and Evelyn seemingly content to let the quiet stand. The food was simple but good, better than anything he'd eaten in years. The biscuits were light, the eggs cooked just right, and the coffee strong without being bitter. I'll be moving fence posts today, he said finally. North pasture needs repair before winter. She nodded. I'll see to the garden plot. Noticed you had one once, by the side of the house. Could get some winter vegetables in if we hurry. We? The word came out sharper than intended. Figure of speech. She stood, gathering the dishes. You need anything from town? I was thinking to walk in later. See about some mending work. The ladies sometimes need help with sewing. That's 20 miles. Yes, sir. Like I said yesterday, I've walked farther. He studied her. This woman who spoke of 40-mile round trips like afternoon strolls. I go to town Saturdays for supplies. That's 3 days from now. All right then, I'll wait. The next days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Evelyn rose before dawn, had coffee ready when Jedediah emerged. She worked without being asked, mucking stalls, gathering eggs, patching holes in the barn walls with whatever materials she could find. When he returned from the fields in the evening, there was hot food waiting, the cabin warm and lit. She kept to herself mostly, sleeping in the lean-to despite the nights growing colder. Sometimes he'd catch her sitting outside in the evening, mending clothes by lamplight, her fingers flying over the fabric with assured movements. Other times she'd be talking softly to the animals, her voice carrying across the yard like a half-remembered song. On the morning of the third day, Jedediah woke to find her in the barn with a heifer, sleeves rolled up and hair tied back. She's struggling, Evelyn said without preamble. Calves turned wrong. Jedediah had delivered plenty of calves, but this was indeed a bad one. The heifer was down, breathing hard, and he could see immediately what Evelyn meant. Without thinking, they worked together, Evelyn holding the heifer's head and speaking soothingly while Jedediah worked to turn the calf. Easy, girl, Evelyn murmured, stroking the heifer's neck. You're doing fine, just a little more. It took an hour of careful manipulation, but finally the calf slid free, wet and gasping. Evelyn was there immediately with straw, rubbing the newborn vigorously while Jedediah tended to the mother. She's a beauty, Evelyn said, smiling as the calf struggled to its feet. It was the first time he'd seen her truly smile, and something about it made him look away. You've done this before, he said. My husband's family had a farm before he joined up. I learned a lot in those years. The smile faded. Lost it while he was away. Couldn't keep up with the payments and the work both. They watched the calf find its mother's milk, the ancient dance of survival playing out in the golden morning light streaming through the barn door. I'll get the wagon ready, Jedediah said abruptly. For town. The ride to Bitter Creek was long and mostly silent. Evelyn sat properly on the wagon seat, back straight despite the jolting of the wheels over ruts. She'd brushed out her dress as best she could, pinned her hair neatly, but there was no hiding the patches and worn places. In town, curious eyes followed them down Main Street. Jedediah Kane, who hadn't been seen with a woman since the fire, riding in with a stranger. He could practically hear the gossip starting. At the general store, he loaded supplies while Evelyn spoke quietly with Mrs. Holcomb, the store owner's wife. He saw coins change hands, saw Evelyn accept a bundle of fabric that needed mending. I'll walk back, she told him when he'd finished loading. Want to stop at a few more houses, see if they need work done. Road's dangerous alone. I'll be careful. She paused. Thank you for the ride in. He left her there, standing outside the seamstress shop, chin up despite the whispers that followed her. Back at the ranch, the silence seemed heavier somehow. He worked on fence repairs, but his mind kept drifting to town, wondering if she'd found more work, if she was walking back yet. The sun was low when he spotted her on the road, that familiar, determined stride eating up the miles. She carried 2 bundles now, and her step seemed lighter. "Good day," he asked when she reached the yard. "Good enough, Mrs. Holcomb needs 3 dresses hemmed, and the minister's wife has curtains to mend. $1.50 altogether, once it's done." She went to the lean-to to put away her things, then emerged to start dinner. As she worked, he noticed her humming, just barely audible, a tune he didn't recognize. That evening, as they ate the stew she'd made from the beef he'd reluctantly provided, she said, "People in town were curious about me being here. I imagined so. One woman, Mrs. Patterson, I think, said I should be careful, said you weren't a man who welcomed company anymore." He set down his spoon. "She's right. Maybe." Evelyn met his eyes steadily. "Or maybe she's just seeing what she expects to see." The next morning, Saturday again, they went to town for supplies. This time, the whispers were louder. At the general store, Jediah overheard 2 women near the fabric display. "Widow Morrison, they say her name is, staying out at the Kane place. Shameful, if you ask me, that poor man, still grieving his wife and child. And here she comes looking for a meal ticket. Maybe she's what he needs. Been 4 years, after all. A woman like that? Please, you can see she's desperate. Probably throw herself at any man with a roof to offer." Jediah's hands clenched on the counter. Before he could speak, Evelyn appeared at his elbow. "Got everything?" she asked calmly, though he could see she'd heard too. Color stood high on her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "Outside, loading the wagon." She finally spoke. "I'm sorry, I'm causing you trouble. It's not your fault, isn't it?" She looked down at her work-worn hands. "Maybe I should move on, find somewhere else." "Where?" The word came out harsher than intended. "You have anywhere else to go?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No." They rode back in silence, but it was different from before. There was something unsettled in the air between them, like the feeling before a storm. That night, after dinner, Evelyn didn't immediately retreat to the lean-to. She sat by the fire, mending one of the dresses from town, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Can I ask you something?" she said suddenly. He tensed, but nodded. "Why did you agree to let me stay? Really?" Jediah stared into the fire, weighing his words. Jimmy asked, "That's all? What else would there be?" She tied off a thread. "Bit it clean." "I don't know. Maybe just simple kindness." "I'm not kind." "No." She looked at him directly. "Then why did you put extra blankets outside the lean-to last night? Why did you leave a ham hock in the kitchen this morning when you thought I wasn't looking?" He stood abruptly. "It's late." But she wasn't done. "Your wife, what was her name?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "Don't. I'm not trying to hurt you. I know what it's like to lose someone, to have people look at you like you're half a person afterward. You don't know anything about it." "Don't I?" She set down her mending, and for the first time, he saw past her steady composure to the pain beneath. "You think you're the only one who's lost everything? My husband died in agony, Mr. Kane. Shot in the stomach, took 3 days to pass. I held his hand while he screamed, and when it was over, I had nothing. His family's farm was gone. My own family wanted nothing to do with a woman who'd married beneath her station. I've been doing washing and mending for 2 years, living in boarding houses when I could afford it, barns when I couldn't. So yes, I do know something about loss." They stared at each other across the small room. 2 people stripped raw by grief. "Sarah," he said finally, the name rusty from disuse. "Her name was Sarah. My daughter was Emma. She was 3. Evelyn's eyes softened. "Thank you for telling me." He turned away, unable to bear the compassion in her face. "I'm going to check the animals." Outside, he leaned against the barn wall, breathing hard. He'd spoken their names. For 4 years, he'd held them inside like fragile glass, afraid that speaking them would shatter what little he had left of them. But the world hadn't ended. The stars still shone overhead. The cattle still lowed in their pens. When he finally went back inside, Evelyn had gone to the lean-to, but she'd left the fire banked properly and a cup of coffee warming on the stove. Small gestures. But they loosened something in his chest he'd thought frozen solid. The next days brought the first serious cold snap. Jedediah found himself checking the lean-to's walls for drafts, bringing extra wood for the little stove. When Evelyn mentioned the pump was freezing at night, he spent an afternoon wrapping it in sacking and old blankets. "Thank you," she said simply, watching him work. "Can't have you freezing. Who'd make the coffee?" It was a poor attempt at humor, but she smiled anyway. That evening, as she served dinner, a rabbit stew made from game he'd shot that morning, she said, "The heifer's calf is thriving. You've been checking on them. Every day. She's going to be a good mother, that one." They ate in companionable silence, the kind that had begun to feel less like emptiness and more like peace. When Evelyn rose to clear the dishes, her hand briefly touched his shoulder as she reached for his plate. It was accidental, casual, but Jedediah felt it like a brand. How long since anyone had touched him? How long since he'd allowed it? That night, unable to sleep, he stood at his window looking out at the lean-to. The light was still on, and through the gaps in the wall, he could see her shadow moving as she worked on the mending that would earn her $1.50. A hard worker. Jimmy had promised. He'd been right about that. But Jimmy hadn't mentioned the way she hummed while she cooked, or how the animals trusted her instinctively. He hadn't said anything about her stubborn pride or the way she met the world's harshness head-on without flinching. He hadn't warned Jedediah that having her here would make the empty spaces in his life suddenly visible, like shadows thrown by a new light source. Jedediah turned from the window and forced himself to lie down. "Come spring," he told himself. "Come spring." She'd have saved enough to move on, find a proper situation somewhere. Until then, he could endure the disruption to his carefully ordered loneliness. He could ignore the way the cabin felt warmer with her nearby, the way proper meals and clean clothes had begun to feel less like intrusions and more like small mercies. Come spring, everything would go back to the way it was, the way it had to be. But outside, winter was settling over the prairie like a thick blanket, and in the lean-to. Evelyn Morrison mended other people's clothes by lamplight and tried not to think about the man in the cabin who wore his grief-like armor, or the way his rare, rusty attempts at kindness made her heart constrict with something dangerously close to hope. The storm arrived without warning on a Tuesday evening in late October, rolling down from the mountains like an angry beast. The temperature plummeted, and rain mixed with sleet began hammering the roof just after sunset. Jedediah secured the livestock and battened down what he could, but this was shaping up to be one of those early winter storms that caught everyone unprepared. He was heading back to the cabin when he noticed the lean-to door banging in the wind. Through the driving rain, he could see that the little stove's chimney had been knocked askew by the wind. Without heat, the space would be freezing within hours. Inside the lean-to, he found Evelyn trying to wrestle the chimney pipe back into place, her hands already red with cold. Water streamed through the gap where the pipe had separated from the roof. "Leave it," he said roughly. "Get your things. I can fix it. Get your things," he repeated. "You'll freeze out here tonight." She hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Another gust of wind decided for her, sending a shower of icy water through the gap. Within minutes, she'd gathered her few possessions into her carpet bag. They ran through the rain to the cabin, Evelyn clutching her bag against her chest. Once inside, they stood dripping on the floor, an awkward awareness filling the small space. She'd been living on the ranch for nearly a month, but this was different. This was his sanctuary, the place he'd kept separate. "I'll bed down by the fire," she said quickly. "Just for tonight." He grabbed a blanket from his trunk, handed it to her. "There's dry clothes in there too. Sarah's things. They'll fit you better than what you've got." Her eyes widened slightly, but she only nodded, while she changed behind the curtain he'd strung up years ago and never removed. He busied himself stoking the fire and making coffee. When she emerged, wearing Sarah's simple blue dress, he had to turn away. The sight was like a knife between his ribs. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll wash and return it as soon as—" "Keep it. No sense in it going to waste." They spent the evening in careful politeness, Evelyn mending by the fire while Jedediah cleaned his rifles at the table. The storm raged outside, making the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. Every movement seemed loud, the whisper of thread through fabric, the click of gun parts, the pop of wood in the fire. "My husband," Evelyn said suddenly. "He used to clean his rifle just like that. Same motions, same order, said the routine calmed him. Army teaches you proper care." Jedediah replied, "Weapon fails. You die." "Is that where you met? The Army?" "Cavalry. Only served 6 months before I bought out." He paused, surprised to find himself continuing. "Had enough saved to start this place. Sarah was waiting for me to get settled before we married." "She must have been proud of what you built." "She was—" the words came easier than expected. "Had plans for it. Garden, chicken coop where she wanted it, a room for—" He stopped. "For children," Evelyn finished gently. He nodded, unable to speak. They lapsed into silence again. But it felt different now, less like walls between them and more like a shared understanding. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, and Evelyn shivered despite the fire. "You're cold." "I'm fine," but her lips had a blue tinge, and her hands shook as she tried to thread her needle. Without thinking, Jedediah grabbed another blanket from the trunk and draped it around her shoulders. His hands lingered for just a moment, feeling the tremor that ran through her. "You're burning up," he said, alarmed. "Just cold," she insisted. But when she tried to stand, she swayed. He caught her before she could fall, one arm around her waist, and was shocked by the heat radiating from her body. "You're ill." "It's nothing. I've been fighting it for days." "Days?" He half carried her to his bed, her protests weak. "Why didn't you say something?" "Couldn't afford to be sick." Her teeth chattered. "Had work to finish." He covered her with every blanket he owned, built up the fire until the cabin was stifling. But still she shivered, her skin flushed with fever. As the night wore on, she began to mumble, lost in delirium. "James," she called out. "James, don't leave me, please." Jedediah wrung out a cloth in cool water, wiped her burning forehead. Her hand caught his, held tight. "I'm sorry," she muttered. "Should have been a better wife. Should have given you children before you left." "Shh," he found himself saying. "Rest now." But she grew more agitated, thrashing against the blankets. "Can't find him. They won't tell me where they buried him. Just want to say goodbye." Her anguish was so raw it made his chest ache. Without thinking, he sat on the edge of the bed and gathered her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed for a man 2 years dead. She burned against him like a coal, but gradually her crying eased. "Safe now," he murmured, words he'd once said to Emma during nightmares. "You're safe." She quieted, her head falling against his shoulder. He should have laid her back down, returned to his chair by the fire. Instead, he found himself studying her face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way illness had sharpened her features. When had she become familiar to him? When had he stopped seeing her as an intrusion and started seeing her as Evelyn? The fever broke near dawn. Jedediah, who'd spent the night in the chair after all, woke to find her looking at him with clear eyes. "The storm?" she asked hoarsely. "Past. How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by horses." She struggled to sit up, blanching. You should rest." He pressed her back down, his hand gentle but firm. "I'll see to the animals." "But breakfast." "I managed 4 years without you. I can manage one morning." When he returned from the barn, she was asleep again, but it was a healing sleep now. He made coffee, burned some eggs, and sat watching the sunlight creep across the floor toward the bed. She'd kicked off some blankets in her sleep, and one arm was flung above her head like a child's. He thought about the night before, holding her while she grieved. The weight of her in his arms had awakened something he'd thought dead, not desire, exactly, but a bone-deep loneliness he'd been able to ignore until now. Having another person in his space, depending on him, needing him. It was terrifying and strangely right at the same time. She woke in the afternoon, disoriented. Did I say anything? Last night? You called for your husband. Her face crumpled with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Nothing to apologize for. He handed her a cup of water. Grief doesn't follow rules. She studied him over the rim of the cup. No, it doesn't. For 3 days, she recovered. Jediah found himself falling into the role of caretaker with disturbing ease. He made simple broths, helped her to the chair by the fire when she grew tired of the bed, even read to her from his few books when she grew restless. You're being too kind, she said one evening as he handed her another cup of tea. Just being practical. Can't have you dying on my land. Too much paperwork. She laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. It transformed her face, making her look years younger. Of course, the paperwork. On the 4th day, she was well enough to move around, though he forbade her from returning to the lean-to, which still needed repairs. She'd taken over the cooking again, humming as she worked. The cabin felt different with her in it, warmer, certainly, but also more alive. Her few possessions had found homes on surfaces, her brush on the washstand, her sewing basket by the chair, the daguerreotype of her and James on the mantel next to the one photograph Jediah had of Sarah and Emma. That evening, as they ate the stew she'd made, she said, I walked too far the other day, before the storm. Oh, there's a hill about 5 miles north. I could see for miles from the top. She paused. There's a grave up there. Jediah's spoon stilled. He knew the hill she meant, knew the wooden cross that marked it. That's where I go, he said quietly. When it gets too hard, to be with them, to think about joining them. The words hung in the air between them. Evelyn reached across the table, her fingers barely brushing his hand. But you don't. No, though I've come close. He turned his hand palm up, almost but not quite holding hers. Closer than I like to admit. What stops you? He thought about it. Stubbornness, maybe, or cowardice. Can't decide which. Neither. Her fingers curled around his. It's strength, the hardest kind. They sat that way for a long moment, hands linked across the rough table. Outside, a coyote howled, and the wind picked up again. But inside the cabin was warm and lamplit, and for the first time in 4 years. Jediah didn't feel alone. I should still repair the lean-to, he said finally. Or, she said carefully, I could stay here, just through winter. The lean-to's too cold anyway, and it seems foolish to waste wood heating 2 buildings. He should refuse, should maintain the boundaries that kept him safe. Instead, he heard himself saying, the curtain stays up, you take the bed, I'll use the floor by the fire. That's not, those are the terms. She squeezed his hand once before letting go. All right. That night, as he lay on his makeshift pallet by the fire, he could hear her breathing on the other side of the curtain. Such a small sound, but it filled the darkness in a way that made his chest tight. He thought about her hand in his, about the way she'd laughed, about the words she'd used. Strength. Jediah? Her voice was soft in the darkness. Yeah? Thank you for taking care of me. You'd have done the same. Yes, she agreed. I would have. It was a simple exchange, but somehow it felt like a promise, like the first crack in a dam that had held for too long. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of her breathing, letting it anchor him to the present instead of the past. In the morning, he'd fix the lean-to anyway, give her the choice. But he already knew what she'd choose. Just as he knew that having her here was changing something fundamental in the careful emptiness he'd cultivated. It scared him more than any storm, more than illness or injury. Because for the first time in 4 years, he was starting to feel alive again. and he wasn't sure he was ready for what that might mean. November brought the first real snow, transforming the prairie into a white wasteland that stretched endlessly under a pewter sky. The routine of the ranch continued. Animals to feed, water to break through ice, repairs to make before the deep cold set in. But inside the cabin, something had shifted fundamentally. Evelyn had been living in the main house for 2 weeks now, and they'd fallen into a rhythm that felt dangerously like domesticity. She rose early to make coffee. He tended the stock. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence. Evenings were spent by the fire, her with her endless mending, him repairing tack or sharpening tools. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't, but the silence had lost its sharp edges. It was on such an evening that the letter arrived. Jedediah had been to town for supplies, returning late with the snow beginning to fall. Evelyn met him at the door, helping him carry in the packages. "Howard gave me this," he said, producing an envelope. "For you." Her face changed when she saw the handwriting. She took the letter with hands that trembled slightly and moved to the window to read it by the fading light. Jedediah busied himself putting away supplies, but he couldn't help watching her reflection in the glass. Her expression went from hopeful to troubled to something that looked like resignation. "My sister," she said finally, folding the letter carefully. "She's in Kansas, married to a merchant there. Everything all right?" She turned from the window, and he could see her struggling with something. She's offered me a position in her household. Her husband has connections, could arrange work for me in one of the shops." She paused. Or she knows a widower there, a good man, she says, with a prosperous farm, looking for a wife." The words hit Jedediah like a physical blow, though he kept his face carefully neutral. That's good news then, is it?" She moved to the table, sat down heavily. "I suppose it is. A chance for a real life again. Security, maybe even children." He finished when she couldn't. "Yes." They were quiet for a long moment. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, muffling the world in white. "When would you go?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "She says to come as soon as weather permits. Spring, most likely, unless—" She looked at him directly. "Unless I wrote back saying I'd found another situation. Have you?" The question hung between them, loaded with meanings neither was ready to acknowledge. "I don't know," she said softly. "Have I?" That night, lying on his pallet by the dying fire, Jedediah stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine the cabin without her. Empty coffee pot in the morning. Silence at meals. No humming while she worked. No soft footsteps. No quiet breathing beyond the curtain. Just him and his ghosts again. The thought made him restless. He rose and went to the window, looking out at the falling snow. In the barn, a horse nickered. Everything was as it had been for 4 years, except for the woman sleeping in his bed and the way her presence had wormed into every corner of his carefully maintained solitude. He was so lost in thought that he didn't hear her rise, didn't know she was there until she spoke from behind him. "Can't sleep." He shook his head. She came to stand beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. They watched the snow together, neither speaking. "I don't want to go to Kansas," she said finally. "Your sister—" "My sister means well, but she's never understood. She married for security, lives a proper life in a proper house with a proper husband who bores her to tears. She thinks that's what I need." She pulled the blanket tighter. "Maybe she's right. What do you think you need?" She was quiet so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "I used to know, before James died. I knew exactly what I wanted. A home, children, someone to grow old with, and simple things. But now," she turned to look at him, "now I think maybe I just need to feel useful, needed, like I'm not just marking time until I die." "You are needed," he said roughly. "The ranch has never run better. The animals are healthier. The house is—" He gestured helplessly. "It's a home again, not just a place to sleep. Is that enough For you? He wanted to say yes, to keep things simple, safe. Instead, he found himself telling the truth. I don't know anymore. She reached out, her fingers touching his arm lightly. Jedediah? The sound of his name in her voice undid something in him. Before he could think, he turned toward her, his hand coming up to cup her face. Her skin was soft, warm under his calloused palm. Her eyes widened, but she didn't pull away. Don't go to Kansas, he said hoarsely. Give me a reason to stay. The space between them crackled with tension. He could see the pulse beating at her throat, could feel the warmth radiating from her body. All he had to do was lean down, close that small distance. Instead, he stepped back, his hand falling to his side. I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't. The hurt that flashed across her face was quickly hidden. Of course, I understand. She turned to go back to bed, but he caught her arm. Evelyn, wait. It's not you, isn't it? She looked back at him, and he could see tears gathering in her eyes. Or is it that I'm not her, not Sarah? That's not, because I know I'm not her. Jedediah, I know I can't replace what you lost, but I'm not asking to. I'm just asking. Her voice broke. I'm just asking you to see me. Just me. I do see you. The words tore from him. That's the problem. I see you every damn day, and it's... He released her arm, ran his hand through his hair in frustration. Do you know what it's like to start feeling again after being numb for so long? It's like when your foot falls asleep and then the blood comes back. It hurts. I know, she whispered. I know it hurts. I can't lose someone again. I won't survive it. So instead, you'll just... What? Stay half alive forever? If that's what it takes. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. I'll write to my sister tomorrow. Tell her I'll come in the spring. Evelyn. No. She held up her hand. You've made your choice. Now I need to make mine. She went back to bed, leaving him alone by the window. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in pristine white, hiding all the broken places. But Jedediah knew they were still there, underneath. They always were. The next days were excruciating. They continued their routine, but the easy companionship was gone, replaced by a careful politeness that was somehow worse than hostility. Evelyn wrote her letter, though Jedediah noticed she didn't immediately ask him to take it to town. It sat on the mantel like an accusation. On the third night, unable to bear the tension, Jedediah escaped to the barn after supper. He stayed there for hours, mending harnesses that didn't need mending, organizing tools that were already organized. When he finally returned to the cabin, he expected to find it dark. Instead, Evelyn was sitting by the fire, the letter in her hands. She'd been crying. He could see the tracks on her cheeks. I keep trying to convince myself this is right, she said without looking at him. Kansas, a new start, maybe even a new husband, children, everything I thought I wanted. It is what you want. Is it? She finally looked at him. Or is it just what's expected? What's proper? She held up the letter. Do you know what my sister writes? She says the widower, Mr. Garrett, is 47 years old with 3 children who need raising. She says he's looking for someone practical, someone who won't expect romance or passion, just partnership. She laughed bitterly. As if I'm a broodmare past her prime, good for nothing but work and warming his bed. You're more than that. Am I? Because sometimes I wonder, sometimes I think maybe that's all any of us are. Just going through the motions, doing what's expected, until we die. He crossed to her, knelt by her chair. Don't say that. Why not? Isn't that what you're doing? Going through the motions? Yes, he admitted. Or I was. Until... He took the letter from her hands, set it aside. Then, with infinite care, he took her hands in his. They were trembling. Until you came here and reminded me what it felt like to be alive. Jedediah, I'm scared, he said, the words coming hard. terrified. Every morning when you make coffee, every evening when you hum while you sew, every time you laugh, it terrifies me because I can feel myself caring again, wanting things I thought I was done with. What things? He brought her hands to his lips, pressed a kiss to each palm. You, a future, the chance to be something more than a ghost haunting his own life. Then why push me away? Because I'm a coward, because losing Sarah and Emma nearly killed me, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to risk that kind of pain again. She freed one hand, touched his face gently. What if I promise not to die? Despite everything, he almost smiled. Can you promise that? No more than you can, but I can promise to live while I'm here. Really live. Not just exist. Can you? He turned his face into her palm, closed his eyes. I don't know. Try, she whispered. Please, just try. He lifted his head, met her eyes. What he saw there, hope and fear and something deeper, broke through the last of his defenses. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he leaned up and kissed her. It was gentle at first, almost hesitant. Then her hands came up to frame his face, and the kiss deepened, became something desperate and necessary. 4 years of loneliness, of frozen emotion, melted it in the heat between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Stay, he said roughly. Not for Kansas, not for your sister, for me, for us. Us, she repeated, testing the word. Is there an us? I don't know, but I want to find out. He stood, pulling her up with him. If you'll have me, damaged as I am. We're all damaged, she said. The question is whether we let it define us. He drew her into his arms, held her against him. She fit perfectly, her head just under his chin, her body warm and solid and real. I can't promise it'll be easy, he warned. I've forgotten how to be with someone, how to share a life. Then we'll remember together. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other while the fire burned low. Finally, Evelyn pulled back slightly. The letter? He glanced at the envelope on the floor. Your choice. She picked it up, studied it for a moment, then tossed it into the fire. They watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash. No going back now, she said. No, he agreed, and kissed her again. Later, much later. They lay entwined on his narrow pallet by the fire. The curtain that had separated them for weeks lay crumpled in the corner, no longer needed. Outside, the snow had stopped, and stars showed through the clouds. I should probably write to my sister, Evelyn said drowsily. Tell her I found another situation. What will you say? She was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. The truth, that I've found someone who needs me, someone I need too. He tightened his arms around her. I do need you, more than I knew how to say. I know. She lifted her head to look at him. But Jediah, I meant what I said. I'm not trying to replace her. Sarah, I'm not trying to make you forget. I know. He touched her face gently. And I'm not trying to replace James. We both have our ghosts. Maybe that's why this works. We understand each other's shadows. She laid her head back on his chest. Do you think they'd approve? Sarah and James? He thought about it, remembering Sarah's generous heart, her way of taking in strays, cats, dogs, people. Yeah, I think they would. I think they'd want us to be happy. Happy? Evelyn murmured. Such a simple word for such a complicated thing. We'll figure it out. He promised. And for the first time in 4 years, he actually believed it might be possible. The news traveled faster than wildfire through drought-stricken grass. By the time Jediah made his next trip to town for supplies, 2 weeks after Evelyn had burned her sister's letter, everyone seemed to know that the widow Morrison was still at the Kane Ranch, and speculation about why ran rampant. At the general store, conversation stopped when he entered. Women who'd ignored him for years suddenly found reasons to linger near the counter while he made his purchases. Men gave him knowing looks that made his jaw clench. Jediah, Howard Briggs said carefully as he tallied up the bill. Everything all right out at your place? Fine. Good, good. Howard cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison still helping out? She is. Well, that's fine then. But Howard's expression suggested otherwise. Just wanted to make sure everything was proper. Jediah's hand stilled on the counter. Meaning? Nothing. Howard busied himself wrapping the bacon. Just that people talk, you know. Widow woman, single man, living under the same roof. People should mind their own business. Now, Jediah, no need to get tetchy. I'm just saying what others are thinking. For your own good. And hers. Jediah left without another word, but he could feel eyes on him all the way down Main Street. The ride home felt longer than usual, his mind churning over the implications. He'd been selfish, keeping Evelyn at the ranch without thinking about her reputation. In his isolation, he'd forgotten how cruel small-town gossip could be. When he arrived home, he found Evelyn in the garden plot she'd managed to clear despite the frozen ground, planting winter vegetables with determined efficiency. She looked up at his approach, her smile fading when she saw his expression. What happened? Nothing. He began unloading supplies, avoiding her eyes. Jediah, he sighed, set down the sack of flour. People are talking about you being here. Ah. She stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. And what are they saying? What you'd expect. She was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. Let them talk. It's not that simple. Your reputation. My reputation. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. What reputation? I'm a widow with no money, no family to speak of. Working as a hired woman, what exactly do I have to lose? You could still go to Kansas. Start fresh. Her face went cold. Is that what you want, for me to leave? No. The word came out more forcefully than intended. But maybe it would be better. Safer. Safer. She studied him. You mean easier. For you. Before he could respond, they heard horses approaching. 3 riders came into view, and Jediah recognized them with a sinking heart. Thomas Garrett, the town's self-appointed moral guardian, flanked by 2 of his cronies. Stay here, Jediah told Evelyn, but she followed him anyway, stopping just behind him as the men dismounted. Jediah, Garrett said, tipping his hat mockingly. Ma'am. Thomas boys. Jediah kept his voice level. Something I can do for you? Just come to have a word about the situation here. No situation here that concerns you. Well now, that's where you're wrong. Garrett's eyes slid to Evelyn, taking in her work-worn dress, her uncovered hair. See, what happens on one ranch affects the whole community, and having an unmarried woman living in sin. Careful, Jediah warned, his hands clenching into fists. Just calling it what it is. Your poor wife must be rolling in her grave, seeing you take up with the first piece of... Jediah's fist connected with Garrett's jaw before he could finish the sentence. Garrett went down hard, and immediately his 2 companions rushed forward. The fight was brief but vicious, 3 against 1. Jediah gave as good as he got, but numbers told, and soon he was on the ground, blood streaming from his nose and a cut above his eye. That's enough! Evelyn's voice cracked like a whip. She stood over them with Jediah's rifle in her hands, not pointed at anyone, but held with clear competence. Get off this property. Now! Garrett spat blood, struggled to his feet. You'll regret this. Kane, both of you, this isn't over. They mounted and rode off, Garrett holding his jaw. Evelyn immediately dropped the rifle and knelt beside Jediah, helping him sit up. Let me see, she said, gently probing his injuries. It's nothing. It's not nothing. Her voice shook. Your hand might be broken. She helped him inside, her arm strong around his waist. As she cleaned his wounds, he could see the guilt and determination warring in her expression. This is my fault, she said quietly. No. Yes, they're right, you know. About what people will think, what they'll say. She wrung out the bloody cloth with hands that trembled. I'm ruining your life just by being here. You're not... Your reputation in town. Any chance of rebuilding connections, moving past your grief. I'm destroying all of it. He caught her hand, stilled its motion. Evelyn, look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly. I don't care what they think, any of them. You should care. This is your home, your community. No. He struggled to find the right words. This ranch is my home. You're my... He stopped, the word catching in his throat. You're what? She whispered. But the moment was broken by a wave of dizziness. His head throbbed where someone's boot had connected, and his ribs protested with every breath. Evelyn insisted he lie down, and he was too hurt to argue. She tended him through the night as his injuries stiffened and swelled. His right hand was indeed badly damaged, though she didn't think it was broken. His ribs were bruised, possibly cracked, and the cut above his eye needed careful cleaning to prevent infection. In his fevered half-sleep, he mumbled things he wouldn't have said awake. Sarah's name, yes, but Evelyn's too. Fragments of sentences about fire, about loss, about being afraid. At one point, he gripped her hand hard enough to hurt. Don't leave, he muttered. Please, can't do this alone anymore. Shh, she soothed, stroking his hair back from his forehead. I'm here. Promise. I promise. But even as she said it, she was making plans. This couldn't continue. She couldn't let him destroy himself for her sake. By morning, she'd made her decision. When Jediah woke, the cabin was cold, the fire had died to embers, and pale dawn light filtered through the windows. His body ached in too many places to count. But what alarmed him was the silence. No coffee brewing, no soft humming, no quiet footsteps. Evelyn? He struggled upright, biting back a groan. Her belongings were gone. The brush from the washstand, the sewing basket, the daguerreotype. On the table lay a single sheet of paper and the handkerchief he'd given her months ago, carefully washed and folded. His hands shook as he picked up the letter. Dear Jediah, by the time you read this, I'll be on my way to town to catch the morning stage. Please don't follow me. You were hurt defending my honor, and I can't bear the thought of causing you more pain. You gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. You showed me kindness when your own heart was breaking. For that, I'll always be grateful. But I see now that my presence here is only making things harder for you. You need to heal, not just your body, but your heart. You can't do that with me here, stirring up gossip, forcing you to fight battles you shouldn't have to fight. You've been alone so long. I think you've forgotten what it means to be part of a community. I won't be the reason you lose that chance forever. I'm going to Kansas. My sister's offer still stands. And perhaps it's for the best. A new start for both of us. Take care of yourself. Try to forgive, not just others, but yourself. Sarah wouldn't want you to live in shadow forever. With love and gratitude. Evelyn, no. The word tore from his throat. He stumbled to the door, threw it open. The yard was empty, but he could see fresh wagon tracks in the mud. She'd taken the old cart they used for hauling supplies, the one he'd taught her to handle just last week. He tried to saddle his horse, but his injured hand wouldn't cooperate, and his ribs screamed with every movement. By the time he managed it, she'd have too much of a head start. The morning stage left at 8 sharp, if she'd left at dawn. She'd make it with time to spare. He stood in the barn, breathing hard, fighting the urge to try anyway. But what would he say if he caught her? That he needed her? He'd shown that clearly enough, letting her tend his wounds, accepting her care. But need wasn't love, and he hadn't been able to say the words she deserved to hear. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was for the best. He went back inside, sat heavily at the table. The handkerchief lay there, a small square of white cotton that somehow held the weight of all his failures. He picked it up, noticed it still smelled faintly of the lavender soap she made herself. The cabin felt larger without her in it, emptier. The silence pressed against his ears like deep water. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? His solitude back, his walls rebuilt, his heart safely locked away again. So why did it feel like dying? He tried to go about his day, but everything reminded him of her. The coffee pot she'd scrubbed until it shone, The garden plot she'd cleared with such determination, the mended shirts hanging on pegs. Even the animals seemed restless, looking for the woman who'd talked to them like old friends. By afternoon, the pain in his ribs had become secondary to the pain in his chest. He found himself at the window over and over, looking down the road as if she might magically reappear. But the road remained empty, except for the wind-blown dust. As the sun set, he climbed the hill to Sarah and Emma's graves, despite the agony it caused his battered body. The wooden crosses stood silent against the orange sky. "I tried," he told them. "I tried to let someone in again, but I'm no good at it anymore. Don't know how to hold on without holding too tight, how to care without being scared." The wind whispered through the grass, offering no answers. "She made me want things again," he continued. "Made me remember what it felt like to laugh, to plan, to hope, and I let her go because I was too much of a coward to fight for her." He stayed until full dark, then made his painful way back down. The cabin was cold and dark. He didn't bother with a fire or food, just lay on the pallet that still smelled like her and stared at nothing. Somewhere out there. She was on a stage heading east. Tomorrow she'd be farther still, and he'd be here, right back where he started, alone with his ghosts and his cowardice. He closed his eyes, her last words echoing in his mind. "Sarah wouldn't want you to live in shadow forever." No, she wouldn't. Sarah had been all light and laughter, always pushing him to be better, braver. She'd have liked Evelyn. He realized. Would have admired her strength, her refusal to be beaten down by loss, and she'd have had no patience with his self-pity now. "Get up," he could almost hear her say. "Get up and fight for what you want, you stubborn fool." But his body wouldn't cooperate, and his heart felt too heavy to lift. So he lay there as the temperature dropped and the coyotes howled and the empty house settled around him like a shroud. In the morning, he told himself. In the morning, when the pain wasn't so fresh and his body could move without agony, he'd figure out what to do, how to go on, how to return to the half-life he'd lived before she came. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no going back. Evelyn had awakened something in him that wouldn't sleep again, no matter how hard he tried. The question was whether he'd let it drive him back into life or deeper into darkness. As he finally drifted into restless sleep, her words haunted him. Try to forgive, not just others, but yourself. Forgiveness. Such a simple word for such an impossible thing. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only way forward. The only way to honor both the dead and the living. The only way to find his way back to her. If it wasn't already too late. 3 days. That's how long Jediah lasted before the emptiness drove him to action. 3 days of silence that pressed against his skull, of cold meals and colder nights, of waking to find her still gone. His injuries had begun to heal. The ribs still protested movement, but his hand could grip again, and the cut above his eye had scabbed over. On the morning of the 4th day, with fresh snow beginning to fall, he saddled his horse despite the pain and set out for town. He had no plan beyond finding out where she'd gone, but he couldn't stay in that empty cabin another hour. The snow grew heavier as he rode, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and threatening. By the time he reached Bitter Creek, visibility had dropped to mere yards, and the temperature had plummeted. Main Street was nearly deserted, sensible folks staying inside. At the stage office, the clerk, a thin man named Peterson, looked up nervously as Jediah entered, bringing a swirl of snow with him. "Mr. Kane, didn't expect to see anyone out in this weather. The stage to Kansas, 4 days ago. Was there a woman on it? Evelyn Morrison?" Peterson fidgeted with his ledger. "I'm not supposed to give out information about passengers." Jediah placed his hand flat on the counter, leaning forward. "Was she on it?" Yes, sir. Bought a ticket to Dodge City." Peterson swallowed hard. "But Mr. Kane, there's something you should know. We got word yesterday. That stage never made it, got caught in an early blizzard about 50 miles east. They found it this morning, buried in a drift." The world tilted. Jediah gripped the counter to keep from falling. The passengers took shelter at an old way station. Tucker's Rest, it's called. But with this storm, they're trapped there until it passes. Could be days. How many days' supplies does Tucker's have? Not many. It's barely more than a shack. They keep some emergency provisions, but with a full stage. Peterson shook his head. Search party can't get through until this weather breaks. Jedediah was already moving toward the door. Draw me a map. Mr. Kane, you can't be thinking of... It's suicide in this storm. But Jedediah was already gone. Peterson's protests following him into the white fury outside. At the general store, he bought what supplies he could carry, blankets, food, medicine. Howard tried to talk sense into him, but Jedediah wasn't listening. All he could think about was Evelyn, trapped in some drafty way station, possibly hurt, certainly cold and frightened. He set out against all reason, following Peterson's hastily drawn map. The world had become a howling white void, his horse struggling through drifts that grew deeper by the hour. He navigated more by instinct than sight, trusting his mount's sure footing and his own stubborn refusal to turn back. Hours passed in a frozen nightmare. His injured ribs screamed with each jolt. His hands grew numb despite thick gloves. The horse began to stumble more frequently, exhausted by the constant battle against the wind and snow. More than once, Jedediah thought about giving up, finding shelter, waiting for the storm to pass. But then he'd remember Evelyn's face, the way she'd looked at him that last night, and he'd push on. He almost missed Tucker's Rest entirely. Only the faint smell of smoke made him veer left. And then he saw it. A low building nearly buried in snow, with only the chimney and part of the roof visible. Light glowed faintly through one window. He had to dig through a drift to reach the door. When it finally opened, warmth and voices spilled out. A man with a rifle stood in the doorway, squinting suspiciously. "Who goes there?" "Jedediah Kane. I'm looking for someone." The man, the stage driver, by his uniform, lowered the rifle. "Thank God. Thought you might be bandits. Come in, before you freeze solid." The inside of the way station was cramped and smoky, packed with bodies. Jedediah counted quickly. The driver, 2 male passengers, an elderly couple, and there, in the corner by the fireplace, wrapped in a thin blanket that did little to stop her shivering, Evelyn. Her head snapped up at his voice, eyes widening in disbelief. "Jedediah, how did you?" He crossed to her in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside her. Up close, he could see her lips were blue with cold, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch his face, as if to confirm he was real. "You came," she whispered. "In this storm, you came for me. Always," he said roughly. "I'll always come for you." "Hate to interrupt," the driver said, "but if you've got supplies in those packs, we could surely use them. Been rationing what little we have, but it won't last much longer." Jedediah unpacked what he'd brought. The blankets were received like gifts from heaven, the food carefully portioned out. He kept 1 thick blanket for Evelyn, wrapping it around her despite her protests that others needed it more. "How long have you been here?" he asked, chafing her hands between his to bring back warmth. 2 days. The storm hit so fast. The driver did well to find this place." She looked around the cramped space. "We've been taking turns by the fire, but it's so cold." "Here." He pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her. She resisted for a moment, then melted into his warmth with a soft sigh. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured against his chest. "It's too dangerous. I had to." "Why?" He pulled back enough to see her face. "Because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, around them. The other passengers tactfully busied themselves with other things, giving them what privacy the small space allowed. "Jedediah, no, let me finish." He cupped her face in his hands. "I've been a fool, a coward. I let you leave because I was afraid of losing you like I lost them, afraid of feeling that kind of pain again. But these last days without you..." He shook his head. "That's not living. It's just existing. And I'm done with that. Tears tracked down her cheeks. I left to protect you. The town. What they were saying. I don't give a damn what they say. Let them talk. Let them judge. None of it matters if you're not there. He brushed away her tears with his thumbs. Come back with me. Not as my hired help. As my wife. If you'll have me. Your wife? Her voice was barely a whisper. I know I'm not much of a bargain. Broken-down rancher with more ghosts than cattle. But I promise you this. I'll spend every day trying to make you happy. Building a life with you. A real life. Not just surviving. She was crying in earnest now, but smiling through the tears. Yes, yes, of course yes. He kissed her then, pouring all the words he couldn't say into the contact. Around them, someone cleared their throat pointedly, and they broke apart, remembering their audience. Well, the elderly woman passenger said with a smile, that's the nicest thing I've seen in ages. Nothing like a happy ending to warm the heart. But it wasn't an ending. Not yet. They still had to survive the storm, make it back to the ranch. The night was long and cold, despite the fire and shared warmth. Jediah held Evelyn as she dozed fitfully, planning their route back, praying the storm would break by morning. It did. Finally, the wind dying as dawn approached, the world outside was transformed. Snow drifted to the eaves in some places, while others were scoured clean. The sky showed patches of blue between racing clouds. We need to move fast, the driver said, before another storm hits. They dug out the stage, but it was clear the vehicle wouldn't make it through the drifts. The passengers would have to wait for rescue from town. But Jediah's horse, rested and fed, could carry two. You can't leave me again, he told Evelyn as he helped her mount. Never, she promised. You're stuck with me now. The journey back was slow but steady. Evelyn rode in front, wrapped in blankets. Jediah's arms around her as he handled the reins. They stopped frequently to rest the horse and check their bearings. The familiar landscape had been made strange by the storm, but Jediah's instincts held true. It was late afternoon when they finally saw the ranch buildings in the distance. Home. But as they drew closer, Jediah tensed. Fresh tracks led to the house. Several horses recently arrived. Thomas Garrett stood on the porch with two other men, their faces grim. They'd clearly been waiting. Kane, Garrett called as they rode up. Glad to see you made it back. We need to talk. Get off my property. Now, that's just it. Garrett smiled unpleasantly. Might not be your property much longer. See, I've been doing some checking. Seems you're behind on your taxes. Significantly behind. County's prepared to foreclose unless you can pay up. Today, Jediah helped Evelyn dismount, keeping himself between her and the men. How much? Garrett named a figure that made Evelyn gasp. It was more than the ranch made in a year. You've got that wrong. Got the papers right here. Garrett waved a document. Funny how records can get misplaced, then suddenly found. You've got until sunset to come up with the money, or the county takes possession, and I've already arranged to buy it at auction. You bastard. Just business. Kane. Nothing personal. His eyes slid to Evelyn. Though I'd think twice about keeping your woman here. Not the kind of influence we want in our community. Jediah took a step forward, but Evelyn caught his arm. Don't. That's what he wants. Smart woman. Too smart for the likes of you. Garrett mounted his horse. Sunset. Kane. Have the money or be ready to leave. They rode off, leaving Jediah and Evelyn standing in the yard. The weight of this new blow, on top of everything else, was almost too much to bear. How much do you have saved? Evelyn asked quietly. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The cattle? Would take weeks to arrange a sale. We have hours. They went inside, the warmth of the cabin a mockery of their cold despair. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd just promised each other, was about to be ripped away. There has to be something, Evelyn said, pacing. Something we can sell, someone who might lend. She stopped suddenly, her hand going to her throat. Slowly, she reached behind her neck and unclasped something Jediah hadn't even known she wore, a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "This was my mother's," she said softly. "The only thing of value I have left." She opened it, showing him tiny portraits inside. Her parents, young and hopeful. James wanted me to sell it when times got hard, but I couldn't. It was all I had left of them. Evelyn, no, it's just a thing. She closed the locket firmly. Things can be replaced. What we have can't. She pressed it into his hand. There's a jeweler in town, Mr. Hartman. He's fair. I can't take this. You're not taking it. We're saving our home, our future. She smiled through tears. Besides, I'll have something better. I'll have you. He kissed her hard, pouring all his love and gratitude into the contact. Then he was out the door, racing against time and fate. In town, Hartman examined the locket with his jeweler's loupe, his expression growing more interested. This is fine work, old, valuable. He named a price that made Jediah's heart leap. Combined with what he had saved, it would be just enough. I'll take it. As Hartman counted out the money, he said quietly, I heard what Garrett's trying to do. It's not right, using a lady's jewelry to save what should already be yours. Man does what he has to. Indeed, Hartman added an extra bill to the stack. For interest. On the loan I'm giving you, you bring that locket back when you can afford it, and I'll sell it back for what I paid. Jediah looked at him in surprise. Why would you do that? Because Garrett's had this town under his thumb too long? Because you fought for what was right, even when it cost you? And because any woman willing to give up her mother's locket for love deserves to get it back? Jediah gripped the man's hand. Thank you. Go. Sun's getting low. He made it back with minutes to spare. Garrett was already there, clearly hoping to catch them packing. His face fell when Jediah handed over the money. Count it, Jediah said coldly. Then get off my land. Garrett counted twice, hoping for an error, but the amount was exact. This isn't over, Kane. Yes, it is. This from Evelyn, who stood tall beside Jediah. We're getting married. We're staying. And if you or anyone else has a problem with that, you'll deal with both of us. And us. They turned to see Howard Briggs riding up with several other townspeople. Hartman, the minister, even Mrs. Holcomb from the general store. Heard there might be trouble out here. Howard said mildly, Thought you might need witnesses. For the tax payment, make sure everything's legal and proper. Garrett looked around at the assembled crowd. His support suddenly evaporated. Without another word, he mounted and rode off, his remaining allies trailing behind. Well, the minister said, breaking the silence, since I'm here, and there's talk of a wedding. Evelyn laughed. The sound bright as spring water. Not today, Reverend, but soon, very soon. The impromptu gathering turned into a celebration. Someone had brought food, another a fiddle. As the sun set over the snow-covered ranch, the yard filled with music and laughter, something it hadn't seen in years. Later, after everyone had gone, Jediah and Evelyn stood on the porch watching stars appear in the clear sky. I'll get your locket back, he promised. However long it takes. I know you will. She leaned into him. But truly, it doesn't matter. I have everything I need right here. He pulled her close, marveling at the warmth of her, the solid reality of her presence. Just days ago, he'd been ready to return to his half-life, his careful isolation. Now, the future stretched before them full of possibility. What are you thinking? She asked. About spring. We'll need to expand the garden and fix up that spare room. Might need it someday. She looked up at him, hope blooming in her eyes. Someday soon, perhaps. Perhaps. He agreed, and kissed her under the vast Wyoming sky. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly. Their home was safe, their love declared, their future secured. It hadn't been easy, nothing worthwhile ever was. But they'd fought for it, both of them, and won something precious in the process. Not just love, though that was miracle enough, but the chance to live again, truly live. together. Winter gave way to spring slowly that year, fighting every inch of ground it lost. But finally, the snow melted, revealing the prairie grass beneath, and the world began to green again. The ranch came alive with new purpose. Fences that had languished were repaired. The barn got a new roof, and the garden Evelyn had planned all winter began to take shape. They'd married on a brilliant March morning, with the minister coming out from town and half of Bitter Creek in attendance. Even those who'd whispered before couldn't deny the rightness of it when they saw Jedediah and Evelyn together. The way he looked at her like she'd hung the moon. The way she touched his arm and made him smile in a way they'd thought impossible. "Never thought I'd see the day," Howard Briggs had said, pumping Jedediah's hand after the ceremony. "You look 10 years younger, my friend." It was true. The lines around Jedediah's eyes had softened, and the permanent furrow between his brows had eased. He moved with purpose now, not just the mechanical motions of survival, but the energy of a man with reasons to build, to grow, to plan for tomorrow. By late April, they'd transformed the ranch. The spare room Jedediah had mentioned was cleaned out, though they didn't speak about why. Not yet. The hope was too fragile, too precious to name aloud. But Evelyn had been sick in the mornings lately, and there was a new fullness to her figure that made Jedediah's heart race with possibility. It was on such a morning, with Evelyn resting inside after a bout of nausea, that riders appeared on the horizon. Jedediah tensed, memories of Garrett's last visit still fresh. But as they drew closer, he recognized the lead rider, a woman in traveling clothes, sitting straight despite obvious exhaustion. "That's Margaret," Evelyn said from the doorway, where she'd come to look. "My sister. But what's she doing here?" Margaret Winters dismounted with difficulty, her face drawn with fatigue and something else, fear. She was flanked by 2 men Jedediah didn't recognize, rough-looking sorts who kept their hands near their weapons. "Evelyn," Margaret said, rushing to embrace her sister. "Thank God you're all right. When I got your letter about staying here, marrying—" She glanced at Jedediah. "I had to come. To warn you." "Warn us?" Evelyn pulled back. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "It's Charles, my husband. He's not what I thought. The business in Kansas, it's all built on lies. Debts. When creditors came calling, he ran, but not before." She swallowed hard. "Not before selling information about you, about where you are, to someone named Garrett." Jedediah's blood ran cold. "What information?" Margaret's escorts shifted nervously. One of them, older with graying temples, spoke up. "Ma'am, we should tell them everything. They need to know what's coming." "You're right, Mr. Dawson." Margaret took a shaky breath. "Charles discovered something about Evelyn's first husband. James Morrison had a life insurance policy through the Army, a substantial one. As his widow, Evelyn is the beneficiary, but she has to claim it in person. Charles sold this information to your Thomas Garrett for enough money to flee his creditors." "I don't understand," Evelyn said. "Why would Garrett care about—" "Because," Dawson interrupted, "Garrett's planning to force you to sign over the claim. He's got a judge in his pocket who'll rule that as a married woman. You need your husband's permission to claim it. Then he'll use that leverage to force Kane here to sell the ranch for nothing. Or," the younger escort added grimly, "he makes sure Kane can't give permission. Permanently." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jedediah instinctively moved closer to Evelyn, who'd gone pale. "How long do we have?" he asked. "He's maybe a day behind us," Dawson said. "We pushed hard to get here first. Garrett's bringing men, professional guns from Kansas. This ain't going to be like last time. Kane, he means business. Then we'd better be ready." They spent the day preparing. Margaret's escorts, Dawson and his nephew Jake, turned out to be former cavalry, hired by Margaret with the last of her money to see her safely to Wyoming. They were good men, despite their rough appearance, and knew their business. "Ranch is defensible," Dawson observed. "Walking the perimeter, good sight lines, solid buildings. But we're outnumbered. Garrett's bringing at least 6 men, maybe more." "What about the town?" Evelyn suggested. Surely people would help. Some might, Jediah said. But Garrett's got influence. Money. Most folks won't want to get involved in what they'll see as a private dispute. Then we handle it ourselves, Jake said, checking his rifle. Wouldn't be the first time. That night, they kept watch in shifts. Evelyn refused to be relegated to the house, checking and loading weapons with steady hands. Margaret, overwhelmed by the situation she'd inadvertently created, helped as she could. I'm so sorry, she kept saying. I never meant for this. Charles seemed so respectable, so safe. You couldn't have known, Evelyn assured her. And you risked everything to warn us. That's what matters. Near midnight, during Jediah's watch, Evelyn joined him on the porch. The night was clear. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Are you frightened? She asked. Yes. He pulled her against his side. But not for the reasons you might think. Oh? I'm not afraid of Garrett or his hired guns. I'm afraid of losing this. He gestured to the quiet ranch, the life they'd built. Of losing you. Of our child never having a chance to see this place. She stilled. How did you know? The way you've been sick. The way you touch your stomach when you think I'm not looking. He turned to face her. Were you going to tell me? I wanted to be sure. It's still early, and sometimes... She trailed off. I wanted to give you hope. Not more loss. He kissed her gently. You've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have again. This, a child, it's a miracle I don't deserve but will fight like hell to protect. We both will. They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other, until Jake's low whistle alerted them to movement on the road. Riders, he called softly. Coming slow, trying to be quiet. It wasn't Garrett, not yet. Instead, it was Howard Briggs with 3 other men from town, all armed. Thought you might need some help, Howard said as they dismounted. Word is Garrett's planning something foolish. Some of us figure it's time someone stood up to him. You don't have to do this, Jediah said. It's not your fight. The hell it isn't. This from Hartman, the jeweler, who carried a shotgun with surprising familiarity. Man threatens our neighbors, tries to steal what's rightfully theirs. That's everyone's fight. By dawn, they had 8 defenders, not many against Garrett's force, but all good men who knew why they were there. They'd set up defensive positions, using the barn and outbuildings for cover. Garrett arrived with the morning sun, leading 9 hired guns. They stopped just out of rifle range, Garrett riding forward under a white flag. Kane, he called. Let's discuss this like civilized men. No need for bloodshed. Jediah stepped out, rifle in hand. State your business and leave. Garrett. Simple. The woman signs over her insurance claim to me. You sign over the ranch for the generous price of $1, and everyone rides away healthy. And if we refuse, Garrett's smile was cold. Then we take it anyway, and you won't be around to see it. Neither will anyone who stands with you. I've got a counteroffer, Jediah said. You turn around, take your hired killers, and never show your face here again. Do that, and I won't tell the federal marshal about the forged tax documents, the bribes to the county clerk, or the fact that one of your hired guns is wanted for murder in Colorado. Garrett's face darkened. It was a bluff. Jediah had no proof of any of it. But the accusation clearly hit close to home. You're making a mistake, Kane. No, you made the mistake when you threatened my wife. Jediah raised his rifle. You've got 1 minute to decide. Garrett wheeled his horse around, returning to his men. The discussion was heated, with several of the hired guns clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Fighting for pay was one thing. Facing a fortified position defended by determined men was another. Finally, one of them, a lean man with dead eyes, rode forward. Garrett's paying us to take the ranch. Don't much care how. He looked directly at Jediah. But I know you, Kane. Knew your reputation in the cavalry. This ain't worth dying for. We're riding out. Wallace, you coward, Garrett shouted. I paid you. You paid us to intimidate some farmer. This ain't that. Wallace turned his horse. "Any man with sense is coming with me." 6 of the 9 hired guns followed Wallace, leaving Garrett with just 2 men, not enough to take the ranch. And everyone knew it. "This isn't over," Garrett screamed, his composure finally cracking. "You hear me, Kane? I'll ruin you. I'll see you driven from this territory." "Try it," Jedediah said evenly. "But remember, I've got friends now. Good men who'll stand by what's right. You've got money and influence, but that only goes so far." For a moment, it looked like Garrett might try anyway, might order his remaining men forward in a suicidal attack. Then Howard Briggs spoke up. "Thomas Garrett, as a duly appointed representative of the town council, I'm informing you that your business licenses in Bitter Creek are under review. Seems there have been complaints about your practices. Might be best if you found opportunities elsewhere." It was checkmate. Garrett's power came from his position in the town, his ability to manipulate and control. Without that, he was just a bitter man with delusions of grandeur. He left without another word, his remaining men trailing behind. The defenders watched until they were out of sight, then finally allowed themselves to relax. "Well," Hartman said, breaking his shotgun open, "that was exciting. Think he'll be back?" "No," Jedediah said with certainty. "Men like Garrett are cowards at heart. He'll find easier prey elsewhere." In the days that followed, life returned to normal, or rather, to a new normal. Margaret decided to stay, at least for a while, helping Evelyn with the increasing demands of the ranch. The insurance claim was properly filed, providing enough money to secure the ranch's future and expand operations. But the most important change was in the connections they'd forged. The men who'd come to help became regular visitors. Their wives brought food and gossip. The ranch, once a place of isolation and sorrow, became a gathering spot for the community. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Evelyn took Jedediah's hand and placed it on her growing belly. "Feel that," she said. "The baby's moving." He felt it, a flutter, like a bird's wing against his palm. His child, their child, growing strong and safe in this place they'd fought to protect. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn asked, watching his face. "Sarah and Emma," he said honestly. "How they'd have loved you. How happy they'd be that this place is alive again." "You really think so?" "I know so." He pulled her close. "Just like I know James would be glad you found happiness. We honor them by living, Evelyn, by filling this place with love and laughter again." She rested her head on his shoulder. "I want to plant flowers on that hill, where they rest, something that blooms every spring. That would be nice. And when the baby comes, I want to tell them stories about their father who was brave enough to love again, about the people who stood with us, about how sometimes the broken places are where the light gets in." Jedediah kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her against him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Soon, they'd need to go in, tend to evening chores, prepare dinner, but for now, they sat in peaceful silence, watching the day end and feeling life quicken between them. Proof that some things, once thought dead, could bloom again with the right tending. The ranch spread out before them, no longer a monument to loss, but a promise of tomorrow. And on the hill, where 2 wooden crosses stood against the sky, the evening wind whispered through the grass like a benediction, like forgiveness, like a blessing on all that was to come. The first pains came with the late August thunderstorm, as if the baby had decided to arrive with the same drama that had marked its parents' courtship. Evelyn gripped the bedpost, breathing through the contraction while Jedediah hovered anxiously nearby. "It's time," she gasped when it passed. "Send Margaret for Mrs. Cooper." Mrs. Cooper was Bitter Creek's midwife, a sturdy woman who delivered half the babies in the territory. Margaret rode out immediately while Jedediah helped Evelyn get comfortable, though comfortable was a relative term when bringing new life into the world. "I'm scared," Evelyn admitted as another contraction built. "So am I," Jedediah said, holding her hand. But you're the strongest woman I know. You walked 20 miles through dust to get here. You survived that blizzard. You stood up to Garrett. This you can do." The hours that followed tested that strength. Mrs. Cooper arrived with the rain, taking charge with the efficiency of long practice. Margaret boiled water and tore strips of clean cloth. Jediah refused to be banished, despite Mrs. Cooper's protests about it being women's work. "I left once when my family needed me," he said firmly. "Never again." So he stayed, letting Evelyn squeeze his hand until his fingers went numb, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement when she flagged. The storm raged outside, thunder shaking the cabin, but inside there was only the ancient rhythm of birth, pain and rest, push and breathe. The whole world narrowed to this moment, this struggle, this hope. "I can see the head," Mrs. Cooper announced near dawn. "Dark hair, just like Daddy. One more push, Evelyn, one more." With a cry that was part pain, part triumph, Evelyn bore down. And then, suddenly, the cabin filled with a new sound, the indignant wail of a baby taking its first breath. "A girl," Mrs. Cooper said, cleaning the infant with practiced hands. "Perfect and healthy." She placed the baby in Evelyn's arms, and Jediah felt his heart stop, then restart in a rhythm it had forgotten. His daughter, their daughter, tiny fists waving, face scrunched in displeasure at this bright, cold world. "She's beautiful," Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Jediah, look at her." He touched the baby's cheek with one trembling finger. She was so small, so perfect. What should we name her? They discussed this. Of course, if it was a boy, James. But for a girl, Sarah, Evelyn said softly. "Sarah Emma Kane. For the sisters she'll never meet but who made room for her in your heart." Jediah's throat closed. He kissed Evelyn's forehead, then bent to kiss his daughter's downy head. "Sarah Emma," he repeated. "Welcome home, little one." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of feedings and diapers, first smiles and sleepless nights. The ranch work continued. It had to. But now there was always someone singing lullabies. Always the sweet smell of milk and baby powder mixing with leather and hay. The community embraced the new addition with enthusiasm. Women who'd kept their distance before now arrived with baby clothes and advice. Men who'd only nodded to Jediah in town now stopped to ask after the little miss. The ranch, once isolated, became a gathering place for impromptu celebrations of this new life. "She's brought everyone together," Margaret observed one afternoon, watching a group of neighboring women cooing over Sarah Emma. It's like the whole territory was waiting for something to celebrate. It was true. The baby had become a symbol of renewal, of life persisting despite loss. When Jediah carried her up to the hill to meet her namesakes, leaving flowers on the graves, even that felt like healing rather than sorrow. "Your mama would have loved you," he told Sarah Emma, who watched him with solemn blue eyes. "Both of them would have." As autumn progressed, the ranch thrived. The cattle were healthy, the late garden abundant. Jediah expanded the operation, hiring 2 young men to help with the work. Jake Dawson had stayed on after the trouble with Garrett, proving himself invaluable. The insurance money, wisely invested, provided security they'd never dreamed of. But the best moments were the quiet ones. Evelyn nursing the baby by firelight. Sarah Emma's first laugh, surprising them all during dinner. The way she'd grip Jediah's finger with surprising strength, as if to say, "I'm here, I'm real, I'm staying." One evening in early November, with the first snow beginning to fall, Howard Briggs arrived with unexpected news. "Thought you'd want to know," he said, accepting coffee gratefully. "Got a letter from the marshal. Thomas Garrett was arrested in Denver. Seems those accusations you made about forged documents weren't far off. He's facing serious charges." "Good riddance," Margaret said firmly. "There's more," Howard continued. "Garrett's assets are being sold to pay his debts, including something I thought might interest you." He produced a small box. "Hartman asked me to deliver this." Inside was Evelyn's mother's locket, gleaming in the lamplight. "But how—" "Seems Hartman bought it from Garrett's estate and wanted to return it to its rightful owner. Said to tell you the debt's paid in full, with thanks for standing up to a bully." Evelyn cried as Jediah fastened the locket around her neck, where it settled against her heart like a blessing returned. Winter came gently that year, as if in deference to the baby experiencing her first season. The ranch settled into cozy routine: morning feedings, afternoon walks when weather permitted, evenings by the fire with Jediah reading aloud while Evelyn sewed and Sarah Emma dozed in her cradle. "Listen to this," Jediah said one such evening, reading from the territorial newspaper. "Local ranch becomes model for cooperative success." He looked up. "They're writing about us, about how the neighbors working together made everyone stronger." "Fame at last," Evelyn teased. "What else does it say?" "That other communities are following our example. Neighbors helping neighbors instead of going it alone." He set the paper aside. "Imagine that. Us, an example. Why not? Look what we've built." She gestured around the warm cabin, the baby sleeping peacefully, the sense of home that filled every corner. From ashes, literally in your case. If that's not inspiring, what is? On Christmas Eve, they hosted a gathering for everyone who'd become part of their extended family. The cabin overflowed with people, laughter, and food. Sarah Emma passed from arm to arm, seemed delighted by the attention. "A toast," Howard called out, raising his glass, "to second chances, to courage, and to the reminder that none of us stands alone." "Hear, hear," the crowd responded. Later, after everyone had gone home through the gentle snow, Jediah and Evelyn sat by the dying fire, the baby finally asleep between them. "Perfect day," Evelyn murmured. "Perfect life," Jediah corrected. "Not easy, not without pain, but perfect in its own way." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come here?" "Every day." He took her hand. "And every day I thank God and Jimmy Morrison for sending you to my door." She squeezed his fingers. "I've been thinking, this spring, when Sarah's a bit older, I'd like to start that school we talked about. For the local children. Here. Why not? We have the space, the community has the need, and I have the knowledge." She smiled. "Besides, Sarah Emma will need playmates eventually." "Eventually?" He raised an eyebrow. "Planning on more children?" "Aren't you?" He laughed, the sound rich and full. "I'm planning on whatever makes you happy. A school, more children, a whole town if you want it." "Just this," she said. "Just our family, our home, our life. It's more than enough." As if in agreement, Sarah Emma stirred, making the small sounds that preceded waking. Evelyn lifted her, settling her to nurse, and Jediah watched them both with a love so fierce it took his breath. 4 years ago, he'd stood in this same room and wished for death. Now he couldn't imagine wanting anything but this woman, this child, this life they'd built from the ashes of tragedy. It wasn't the life he'd planned, back when Sarah and Emma were alive, but it was the life he'd been given, and he was finally, fully grateful for it. Spring came early the next year, and with it, new growth everywhere. The school opened with 6 students, then grew to 12. Sarah Emma took her first steps in the garden, chasing butterflies with delighted shrieks. The ranch expanded again, becoming one of the most successful in the territory. And on the hill where 2 crosses stood, the wildflowers Evelyn had planted bloomed in profusion, a living reminder that beauty could grow from sorrow, that love could bloom again in the most unlikely ground. Years later, when Sarah Emma was old enough to understand, they would tell her the story, how her mother had walked through dust and storm to find her father, how her father had ridden through blizzard to bring her mother home, how love had conquered fear, community had defeated greed, and 2 broken hearts had mended each other. Was it really that dramatic? She would ask, skeptical as only a teenager could be. "Every word," Evelyn would assure her. "Sometimes life is more dramatic than any story." "And they all lived happily ever after?" Sarah Emma would tease, knowing how her parents hated that phrase. "No," Jediah would say, pulling both his women close. They lived, really lived, with all the joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle that implies. And that, little one, is so much better than happily ever after. The sun would set over the ranch, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and rose. The cattle would low in the distance, the wind would whisper through the grass, and the Kane family would sit together on their porch, watching another day end in the place where their story began. Not an ending, but a continuation, not perfect, but real, not without loss, but ultimately defined by love. And in the growing dusk, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the land itself whispering its approval of lives well lived, of love hard won, of the endless possibility of starting again. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Jediah and Evelyn's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. Where are you listening to this story from? Please leave a comment below. I'd love to know if you're enjoying this from a ranch in Texas, an apartment in New York, or perhaps somewhere across the ocean. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about the story. What was your favorite moment? Did the ending satisfy you? Let's connect in the comments below.